Good afternoon. We're going to get started. Thank you so much for being here. We are so excited that all of you are here. And when I say we, I'm Eula Taylor, and I'm the chair of the Department of African American Studies. And
hi, everybody. This is such a beautiful room. My name is Keith Feldman, and I'm the chair in the Department of Ethnic Studies.
And together, the Department of African American Studies and Ethnic Studies are coming together to celebrate the life of Professor Robert Allen, because he taught in both of our departments. And in fact, he taught in Ethnic Studies longer than he taught with us. It's like he was downstairs on the 5th floor, and we brought him up to the 6th floor and wouldn't let him go. And so we have a packed schedule, and we want to begin with a land acknowledgement.
So I'll go ahead and read a land acknowledgement. We are joining you today from the campus of UC Berkeley, sited on the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. We acknowledge and pay respect to the Muwekma Ohlone ancestors, peoples today, and the Muwekma Ohlone future to come. One way to make concrete such acknowledgement is through the payment of Shumi land tax, a material way for non-Indigenous people living in the East Bay to participate in the rematriation of land to Indigenous people. You can find more information on Shumi land tax at segorite-landtrust.org. Welcome, everybody. Now, I'll pass the mic to the wonderful Daphne Muse.
Thank you. Welcome to the celebration of life for the father of Casey, scholar, journalist, activist, and extraordinary teacher, Dr. Robert Allen, as well as husband and friend, Robert, Roberto, and Big Bob, all terms of respect and endearment by which he was known. And as his former student at Mills College and co-founder of Art Aids Art, Dorothy Yumi Garcia noted, a North Star for how I make my way through the world. Robert's well-lived life included acknowledging that his well-being was integrally tied to the rest of the universe and planet through the stars, wild trees, roar of waves splashing along the shores of the Pacific Ocean, and ancestral shout-outs from Dr. W.B. Du Bois, Harriet Tubman, Dr. Benjamin Mays, and his dearly cherished mother, Sadie Allen, a dean of students at Spelman College. In keeping with the established protocols, each person speaking will have 5 to 7 Berkeley, not Black church, minutes to speak. I'd like to start by introducing Janet Carter, the former wife of Robert Allen and CEO of Positive Coaching Alliance.
Thank you, Daphne, and thank you so much to the two departments for hosting this. I met Robert when he was on the board of the Oakland Men's Project, a group in Oakland working to educate men, young men, against violence against women. I couldn't believe my eyes or my heart. Here, God, I thought I wasn't gonna cry till the end. Here was this gorgeous, dimpled, smart, accomplished, empathetic, introspective man with intuitive intellect, who was a social justice warrior with a sense of humor and adventure, and one of only a few men in the country dedicating himself at that point to ending violence against women, which at that point was what I was doing as well for my work. One thing led to another, and we were married in 1995. People often ask Robert what motivated him to devote his life to fighting injustice through his research and writing of the stories of unsung heroes, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. He would talk about growing up in the segregated South in Atlanta and how he didn't remember seeing a white person until he was 8 and didn't realize there was a whole other world outside of the segregated Black community. But at age 13, he was profoundly impacted by the horrific pictures of Emmett Till's body. It was then he realized that white people could be dangerous, and they could be dangerous to him as well, because he was the same age as Emmett. He also saw how the story of Emmett's brutal murder changed things. One mother with the courage to show what happened to her son actually was changing the existing narrative. Robert learned the power of individual resistance and collective resistance to injustice in 1967 when he became a draft resistor. He thought the Vietnam War was racist and imperialist and decided that he wasn't going, even if it meant jail. But Robert didn't just resist the draft so that he didn't end up going. He was also worried about all the other young men who he believed were being sent to their death. So he wrote a pamphlet expressing how the war was racist and imperialist and passed it out in front of the induction center, urging others not to go. His writing for publication started the day Malcolm X was assassinated. Sitting in front of Malcolm at the theater where he was speaking, Robert witnessed the horror of the assassination firsthand. Not knowing how to handle the shock of seeing someone assassinated before his eyes, he wrote a description of witnessing Malcolm's assassination from a few feet away. He offered the piece to the Village Voice in New York, where he lived at the time. They turned it down, saying nobody was interested in Malcolm X. So he took it to The Guardian. They published it and hired him on the spot as their first and only Black journalist. As a journalist, he traveled to Vietnam and captured the stories of the Vietnamese people fighting in the resistance. He then traveled across the US telling their stories, racking up a healthy FBI file as he did so. Robert believed that the fabric necessary for social change could be weaved through the stories of unsung heroes resisting injustice, and that it is these stories that could challenge false historical narratives. And his work has proven this to be true. When I got the call from the Secretary of the Navy, Carlos del Toro, a week after Robert died, saying he was going to exonerate all the Port Chicago sailors of the charges against them because he and President Biden were so moved by Robert's book, The Port Chicago Mutiny, which the Reverend Diana McDaniel will talk about later. I was deeply saddened that Robert was not there to see that happen. But then I realized Robert's deep faith that justice would eventually prevail because of the bravery of the Port Chicago sailors fueled his lifelong passion for working toward that day. He would only care that the survivors' families were there to see that day. Robert's work was never about himself. Gloria Steinem and Robert were dear friends, and she asked me to read a tribute to Robert here. Robert Allen was, and I hope will always be, a universal person in our lives. He never tried to benefit from being a male human being in this still patriarchal country, even though his suffering as a Black man benefiting somewhat from patriarchy might have been made that tempting. Even in places and times when gender and education might have given him a ladder to climb, Robert remained his own unique and universal self. By doing that, he gave us all a model of uniqueness and universality, of friendship and humanity. I miss him, and yet I know that his spirit is still with us. I want to end by reading a poem. This is going to be the hardest part for me, so I have to look at Pat so I don't cry. I want to end by reading a poem written for Robert by Alice Walker in 1982. I told her to make funny faces of me. Um, these days, I think of Robert folding his child's tiny shirts, consuming TV dinners, saying a kind of processed flavor, rushing off each morning to school, then to the office, the supermarket, the inevitable meeting, writing, speaking, marching against oppression, hunger, ignorance, and in between, having a love affair with tiny wildflowers and gigantic rocks. Surely, the earth can be saved for Robert. I love that poem. But I know if Robert were here, and I think he is, he would turn that poem into one for his beloved students, saying to all of you, through their stories of truth and resistance, surely the earth can be saved for them. Thank you.
Casey dos Santos Allen, son of Robert.
Mostly, I really want to say thank you for all of you coming here today. It really means a lot. I miss my father every day, and being here is just really a wonderful thing and a wonderful tribute. And some of the memories I have of my father are some of the different places that we lived. My parents broke up when I was young, and when I was about 2, and so I would spend the weekends with my father, and we lived in different places. He lived in the Fillmore in San Francisco when I was very young, and so we would hang out there. And then probably around the age of about 9 or so, he moved over to Mills College and lived there, which was a nice place for me to go and be able to kind of run around and be a kid, and kind of a wild campus there. And so that was really wonderful. And we would do, obviously fun things on the weekends, like we would go up to Mendocino, where he was sharing a place with Alice, and I got to spend a lot of time in the country up there, which is really beautiful, and I was really fortunate to have that experience. And he lived in Mills College. I think we were there for about 2 years or so. And then he moved to a place over in San Francisco on Ashbury. And we used to hang out on the weekends, sometimes in the Haight there. And my dad really loved going to bookstores, so we spent a lot of time going to bookstores and checking things out. And that's something I enjoy doing today as well. And I take my kids to the library pretty much weekly to go look at books and give them that experience. So yeah, we lived there in Ashbury for a couple years. And then I think that was probably about the time he started teaching here in Berkeley, and he got a place over in Lake Merritt. And so we stayed over there. And I remember coming to Telegraph and going to bookstores, and how that was an enjoyable activity for us in the evenings. We'd sometimes do other things like record stores and check out other things as well. My dad really loved going to movies, so we'd go to movies often. But yeah, I think that was probably when I was about 12 or so. And so yeah, that was where he lived for the rest of my childhood that I was spending with him, over there on Lake Merritt. And we would hang out in Oakland and go to different places. So yeah. Oh yeah, one of the things I remember too is he he let me go sailing in Lake Merritt. They have these boats that you can rent there, and you have to take this test to show that you know about sailing and stuff. And I was able to pass that test, and they, lo and behold, gave us a boat. And so there's me and my dad going out on the lake sailing with, and I'm probably about 12 or 13 and really had no real experience sailing, but somehow I passed the test. And so, but we would have a great time doing things like that. And he encouraged me to take on challenges and to try new things. And so I really am honored to be here and to have the chance to speak to all of you and just say a few thoughts about some of my time with my father. And he would talk to me about some of the projects he was working on. We would go to the Black Scholar printing press, the printers, and pick up boxes and boxes of Black Scholar magazine, because he would be taking them to get them mailed off to different places. And the Black Scholar ended up getting an office on Telegraph right at the edge of Oakland and Berkeley border, and so we would go there oftentimes to. He would put me to work mailing things and cleaning up around the place, and but he would, the whole time, he'd be talking to me about different projects he was working on, different articles other people were working on that he was reading. And so I really got a lot of great insight into the projects that he was working on, the people he was working with on these different projects. So, I miss him, and I'm so happy that we're doing this and having this chance to honor him. And just want to thank all of you.
And I'll always remember the horse named Blue up in Boonville. Ameer Loggins, lecturer in African American Studies at UC Berkeley and graduate of the PhD program in African American and African Diaspora Studies at UC Berkeley.
I low-key wasn't expecting my name to come that fast.
Pardon?
I'm just messing with you. So Professor Allen was a part of this. It was a group of 3 elders that was here. One of them is still here, Professor Henry. One of them was Professor Fry, and the other was Professor Allen. And in many ways, they were Black male elders that I didn't have in my life because my grandfathers died pretty young and my dad wasn't around. So I was always in the office hours. I was hooping with Professor Henry. He was fouling the hell out of me. I was in there talking. Professor Fry had what I have inherited from him, a potty mouth. And I keep that in my lectures as my students in the back know. I wanted my students to be here, so my students are in the back. But Professor Allen, what was dope about Professor Allen is I knew him before I read him. And that man that I knew didn't match the man that I read. He would just, hey, how you doing, Ameer? He had a real quiet, he was so quiet, and he allowed me to embrace this term of he was tender.
Absolutely.
He was a really tender man that wrote some of the most revolutionary, excuse me, Eula, shit that I was reading. Professor Allen, so I'm finishing here at UC Berkeley, And I remember one of my last classes was his class. So he's like, so Ameer, what are you gonna do now? That's your, I said, and I'm not gonna use what I said out of respect, but I said basically, I'm a dude from Richmond. I graduated from UC Berkeley. I'm good. It's like that was enough. And he was like, well, you should try to go to grad school. And I said, that's for them other students. That ain't for me. He said, you are one of those students. So it was out of the strength of that, from where I'm from, you respect your OGs. And my OG told me to apply to grad school. So I did. Professor Allen encouraged me to apply to grad school. Professor Allen was on my master's exam. We took 299s together. I mean, I took every opportunity to spend time with Professor Allen. Professor Allen was on my qualifying exam, and he couldn't be on my dissertation for the reasons, because he wasn't whatever his position. But my initial goal was to make sure his name was on the last thing that I did here. A lot of who I am as a professor, as my students are back there, is in this room. Try not to cuss. Is in this room. I get a lot of what I get, like a lot of who I am is in this room physically and in spirit. Because I come out of this department. Professor Allen, there's a lot of people in this room that I've known for a lot of my adult life that may be who I am. And one of the things I'm specifically saying is to my students, this is the beauty of Black studies. Like, embrace it like a family and don't treat it like a department. It's a family. Like, I'm not here because of what he taught me. I'm here because of what he taught me. Like, as a human, as a man. I talked to Professor Allen. He died July 10th. I talked to Professor Allen right before that. We talked for like an hour. And I remember the last thing I said to him, I was like, it's an honor to take your class one more time. He talked to me for about an hour. I was like, man, you still got it. I mean, he was in his bag. We were talking about situations I was dealing with academically, and I was like, bro, you still got the chops. And he's like, oh, okay, Ameer, I ain't got the energy. And that was the last thing we talked about, and I really mean that. It was an honor to take his class one more time because it felt like a 299. It was just me and him chopping it up and him seeing if I knew, and he wouldn't let me get no passes. If I said something he didn't agree with, he would push back, and we were going back and forth, but I felt like I was a grad student again. With one of my elders that I honor, that I love, that will always be a part of my DNA. And if any little bit of me is in a part of my students' DNA, when they move forward, Professor Allen is in you. If any part of the things you hear, and you're like, oh, yes, Professor Allen is in me, the same way Eulah's midterm is gonna be on y'all asses soon. So I just want to end by saying, like, it is an honor to know him. It is an honor to really say that he is going to live in me. He is going to live on my syllabus. My students just read Professor Allen the other day, right before we got here. And I wanted them to also see that there are these people who write these things are actually people. This is the person who wrote those things. And we're honoring him not just because he's a scholar or the work that he did, the work, capital T, capital W. It's that he was just a good man. He was a good human being who cared about people. And I honestly, if somebody ever said something bad about him, that would be somebody I would never talk to again. Because that means you have poor judgment of character. So I appreciate everybody coming out. I appreciate having the space to express how I feel about Professor Allen. And I'm gonna make sure I get out of here in Berkeley time instead of Black folks time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ameer. Rickey Vincent, lecturer in African American Studies at UC Berkeley and graduate of the doctoral program in Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley. And I knew his mama.
Ready. Hello, everyone. It's good to see so many people here, recognizing this great man, this mentor, this elder. I'm glad I got to follow Brother Ameer because we shared the same path. Okay, and as much as African American Studies is a family and it's a department, it's a wilderness on this campus. When you come up here from wherever you come from, and I come from just a couple miles away, I grew up in the flatlands here in Berkeley. But this was a different place. But once I saw Robert Allen, everything was all right. I was holding on to the idea that he was unflappable, but then hearing what he went through in February of 1965 at the Audubon Ballroom, it just explains a whole lot of how our little old drama is just not going to move the dial on Robert Allen. So I always felt at home around him. He was a family friend growing up. My mom, Tony, knew him, and my dad, Ted, he was a writer and a scholar and a radical and a hellraiser. And my mom said, Ted, my dad, and Robert worked together at Ramparts Press. If any of you are familiar with Ramparts Press, that was a radical, hell-raising space for people. And another person that worked there at the time was this guy named Eldridge Cleaver. So I just imagine one day after hours, Robert Allen and Eldridge Cleaver and my dad just smoking something natural and just chopping it up after the day. But this was the space for those things to happen. Thinking about that, I realized Eldridge Cleaver and Robert Allen are probably, in terms of demeanor, probably the most polar opposites you could have. But in terms of a revolutionary fervor, they were really kindred spirits. So again, I felt at home around him because he knew me better than I knew him coming to the campus. And so that was special. And so I was ready to hitch my wagon to him, just like Brother Ameer was. But he didn't have the, whatever the status was as a graduate student that you required to have as an advisor. And I had to kind of push him a little to get through some of those steps so that he could be my advisor. And at the end of graduate work, you get a PhD. And somebody has to, at the ceremony, has to put that gear on. And so we had to jump through a few hoops so that he could be the one to do that. But he already was the one to do that, just as paths went. And as unflappable as he was serious business. And I remember I told him I was all done with my dissertation. It was the bomb, and I had written it this way, and I'd flipped things around. For some of you, it's not easy to write a history where so many things are happening at the same time, and if you do it chronologically, it can get scattered. And I had a design to tell this history in a completely different way. You can look it up. It's in Party Music. That's the book that came out. And so I thought I was good. I thought I was done. And he said, do you have a copy editor? And I was like, what do you mean I need a copy editor? I've published before? He said, do you have a copy? I said, no, I don't have a copy editor. So we said, come with me. Got in this car and we drove to Marcus Books. If y'all are familiar with Marcus Books, then you're familiar with Blanche Richardson. And Blanche Richardson is another one of those people who has a quiet demeanor until it's time for something else. But that's not what this story is. But we went in there and I still wasn't exactly sure what we were, I mean, yeah, there's books here and I'm trying to get published. And he took Blanche aside and said something, blah, 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 $1 a word, blah, 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 blah. And he said, okay, Blanche is your copy editor. And so she will be editing every page of your 400-page dissertation. And I was honored. I didn't know how to measure that because Blanche Richardson. She's the hardest worker in Northern California. If you imagine running a black bookstore, right, all this time, through all the storms that have gone on. And yeah, because of Robert Allen, she made the time to talk to Rickey Vincent and work through all the, I thought I had written something that was ready and no, it wasn't. But it sort of hit me how much gravitas Robert Allen had in the community that he could pull from resources that it's just hard to imagine the path and the weight that this person sort of accumulated over the years because he's so low key about himself and what he does. I was so deeply honored to be a part of some of these moments in his life. I couldn't believe it. And the last time I saw him, he was doing a lecture for his book about the Port Chicago mutiny. And he just did such a magnificent job of tying in these issues that for a lot of young people, well, they're 50 years old, et cetera, et cetera. But he tied it into, he made me want to sign up for the Navy. You know, I was just like, I'm there, I'm in it, and he was in it. He committed. I understood the commitment and the cause, and it was crazy bittersweet when they announced that those young men were exonerated. But I remember it vividly because in my lectures, every semester, I find a way to talk about the Port Chicago Mutiny and A. Philip Randolph and the whole leveraging the 1943 march March on Washington, which basically brought an end to, right, that march didn't happen in 1943, but because of the threat of that march, it led to the desegregation of the military, which led to leveraging that to desegregation of institutions in 1954 and all these different things. And I was like, Robert Allen is sort of at the spark of all these things going on. And it astounds me because I feel like I'm still here gonna discover even more of some of these moments. So I want to thank you all for being here, and I'm just thrilled that you get a little taste of what this man did and what he represents to so many of us. One last thing about Black Awakening in Capitalist America. My copy, if you're a grad student, go get that. If you're in, go get that book. But my copy didn't have a year printed on it. It didn't say what year it was published. And I kept thinking it was published around 1978 or 1980 because he had anticipated all of these trends and threads in the Black Power movement that I thought, wow, that's insightful that he could see. And then, what was it, 69?
68.
68 when he put that together. It just, it was a blueprint. And I think some of our colleagues will tell you that was a blueprint in this field. And so it's, I can't believe that he's gone, and I can't believe that I was even a little spark of activity in his monumental life. And I hope more recognition of him keeps coming. So thank you all.
Laura Chrisman, daughter of Robert Chrisman, the co-founder of the Black Scholar and current owner of the Black Scholar.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I've been absent flew down from Seattle, so I hope I'm lucid, but please forgive me if I'm not. Robert Allen's life with the Black Scholar began in February 1972, when his first article for the journal came into print. He was 29. By September of that year, he was not only associate editor of the journal, but also vice president of the Black World Foundation, the nonprofit that published and governed the journal. And by late December that same year, he had introduced my father to Cuba by organizing a 3-week tour that was to be a transformative moment for the journal, for my father, and for the relationship between the two men, cementing a close professional and personal partnership that lasted over 40 years. It was as a Venceremos Brigade activist that Robert Allen had first visited Cuba early in 1972, where he built houses. Trying to get this to scroll down. Demonstrating in the process the international solidarity he called for in that early Black Scholar article, which he titled On Black Liberation and World Revolution. These interlocking examples of scholarly and physical labor, organizational initiative, revolutionary culture building, both domestic and international, are the hallmarks of Robert's contribution to the Black Scholar Journal. He was at once extremely practical and visionary. His leadership, editorial, and managerial activities came, as I observed them, from an exceptional, selfless dedication to the needs and ends of the collective freedom and self-determination of Black peoples. There's a wide range of subject matter in his publications for the journal. In his first year, we see a dialectic emerging between Robert's concern with the struggle for social justice at home and abroad. After the World Revolution article came a piece on Black liberation and the US presidential election. During the 1970s too, we see his probing of government legislation, its institutional and social implications, his coverage of the Baki case and affirmative action policy. We see also his tricontinentalism, with articles on China since the Great Cultural Revolution. He traveled there. Articles on US banks' support for apartheid South Africa, and of course, articles on Cuba. His internationalism gained a hemispheric flavor when he traveled to Panama in 1980 to participate and report on the Congress of Black Culture in the Americas. His 1970s concern with state legislation, accountability, and repression led later to articles on reparations. His early attention to presidential politics led later to work on the Obama presidency. As an editor, he had addressed issues of Black feminism, masculinity, and gender relations during the 1970s, for example, in the celebrated 1979 Black sexism debate issue. And as an author, he centered these issues in the 1990s with analyses of the Million Man March and of the antisocial impact of pornography. All of his extraordinarily prescient work continues to resonate in the present moment powerfully. His work for the journal stands out too for its striking absence of academic ego, that characteristic selflessness again, and how adeptly Robert deploys the tools of political economy, history, and sociology to create a rigorous understanding that is always practical, always geared towards the programs and priorities of social and political transformation. He brought to all his work also the discipline and the lucid prose of an investigative journalist. Although Robert Allen was not one of the journal's founding fathers in 1969, he and my father together founded the new version of the journal and the Black World Foundation that emerged after the departures of Alan Ross and Nathan Hare, and that lasted 4 decades under their joint leadership. The two men swiftly took their collaboration into the realm of authorship, together composing articles, reports, and interviews. Their symbiotic relationship is a central reason for the success of the journal. They were perfectly complementary in their respective disciplines and interests. My father, the poet and cultural critic, Robert Allen, the social scientist. Their shared social political values, including their belief that the journal should be a forum for multiple perspectives, gave their editorial vision stability. The return trip to Cuba in June 1979 of the two marked a kind of Sankofa moment for Robert Allen, who revisited Los Naranjos, the housing development that he had helped to build in 1972. His 1979-1980 article contains, too, a touching personal reflection on past, present, and future during a social afternoon with their hosts, during which many mojitos were consumed. We see both my father's account of this trip and Robert Allen's equally linger on the mojitos. But I see in both these scenes, the revisiting of the Los Naranjos site and the account of this wonderful social afternoon, I see in both of these scenes very apt metaphors for Robert's Black scholar legacy and achievement. Building houses is an onerous, repetitive, and somewhat invisible work, an investment in a continuously changing future. Robert's legacy work in building the journal from the ground up was similar. He created a robust material and intellectual structure to house the collective project of Black self-determination. He was also building a home. Listen to his description of the warm afternoon with his hosts, along with the mojitos. He says, "Our group could just as easily have been sitting on a front porch in Sparta, Georgia, on this humid summer afternoon. The meandering conversation, now serious, now jocular, the gestures and laughter, the rocking chairs, a flash of deja vu. But we weren't meeting in Georgia. Not yet." End quote. His former youthful home in Georgia gives a figure for a present and future to a Black diaspora connecting across overlapping and divergent experiences. In effect, Robert Allen made the Black scholar into a home for its broad community of readers, a home for both gravity and levity. Future generations can maintain and adapt the house and the home to their own changing conditions and new struggles for social justice. Thank you.
Professor Charles Henry, Professor Emeritus in African American Studies at UC Berkeley.
I'm an OG. I need reminders. Else I'll forget people's names. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to the celebration of Robert Allen. It took me a while to get to know Robert because when he was here, I was gone, and vice versa. That is, the department started hiring him when I was on leave to teach my courses. And I was on leave frequently in the late 80s and early 90s. At first, I approached Robert Chrisman because I knew him before I got to Berkeley to fill in for me for some courses. And he did a course or two, but as you heard, Robert was a poet and a cultural critic, and I think it was him that said, you ought to get Robert Allen to do some of your courses. I said, that makes a lot of sense. And we got Robert to do courses, as did ethnic studies. He did them so well, I got worried about my job. I said, well, why don't we bring him on board? The whole department said, why don't we bring him on board? Not only if we bring him on board, he can teach courses, we can give him administrative duties. And that way we could flip the switch. And so he became a graduate student advisor, who many of you met him as our grad student advisor, and there could be no greater introduction to the department in terms of attracting grad students than for them to talk to Robert Allen. So that was our meeting, but I knew Robert Allen long before I met him because of Black Awakening in Capitalist America. And Michael Omi's agreed to let me say a few words about that book. He's going to speak more about it, but I have to say something because it meant so much to a lot of us young college students in the late 60s. There are about a half dozen books that really influenced the way we thought and the way we acted in terms of protesting, so forth and so on. And that was one of them. I have it down as 1969, but I think that's my paperback $1.75 version, and the hardcover might have come out in '68. But nonetheless, it's come out after 4 years of urban rebellion. It's come out in 2 assassinations of prominent figures. It's come out in '68 with the global student rebellion. It's come out when the Vietnam War is ramping up. It's come out when I think maybe now our 3rd worst president was in office, Nixon. He used to be further down the list, but somebody we know has replaced him at the bottom. But the book had a tremendous influence on us. It talks about the internal colony. This was new language for us in terms of looking at how America has underdeveloped Black America, just as Walter Rodney talks about underdeveloping Europe. He talks about neoliberalism, and this is at a time when we've just elected our first Black mayors of big cities in 1968. A year or 2 later, the Congressional Black Caucus will form, and he talks about being aware of developing a Black elite that will be a neo-colonial elite. He talks about the need for a Black third party. And in 1972, there is the National Black Political Assembly that forms. He talks about Black chauvinism, especially among cultural nationalists. And we'll see Black feminism rise after that. He talks about the privatization of the public sector, which is still very much with us. And he talks about the establishment, the need to establish Black studies departments if we're to make Black studies fulfill its purpose. All of these are cutting edge things. I'm going to say a word about Port Chicago mutiny, although I know someone else is going to speak about that. But I just want to say that every time I taught Black politics, we read Port Chicago Mutiny, and I invited Robert to talk to the class. And I did it because it was a model of how research could make a difference. How you approach people about interviews, humbly, and knowing that it could be very emotional for them. You might have to go back several times. You have to assure them and reassure them that they're not going to be exploited, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then how you can make that count. And of course, Robert agreed every time to come in and talk. I could give the lecture as well as he. I heard it so many times, but I couldn't tell the little stories that he would tell about, I met so-and-so and this is what they did and said, and so forth and so on. So it was a model for me of how scholar activism. Now, I really want to talk about reluctant reformers because I use that in every class. And I have a 90-minute lecture, but Eula said, not today.
No, not today, Charles.
So let me just say that, and of course this was written with Pam Allen. Let me just say that the premise is liberalism and Black equality are not the same thing. When people say all Blacks are liberals, no, they're not. You may talk about Blacks being evangelicals, but Black evangelicals and white evangelicals are two different things. And in The Reluctant Reformers, he's saying liberals who, well, he gives examples throughout history of how liberalism has a blind spot when it comes to race, starting with the abolitionist movement. Most abolitionists were opposed to slavery, but they didn't believe in Black equality. Talks about the populist movement for agrarian reform against the big moneyed interest, who would be the natural allies of rural Georgia farmers, Black sharecroppers. That alliance fell apart because of racism and Tom Watson. The progressive movement. The progressive movement eliminates big city machines where Blacks had a little hold on something, but it doesn't replace it with anything that Blacks can hold on to. The women's suffrage movement, a blind spot in terms of where Black women were. And then he turns the focus onto labor, AFL-CIO's blind spot. Just ask A. Philip Randolph about that. And the socialist and communist parties in the United States. It's all there in Reluctant Reformers, and it quickly dissuades you of this notion that liberalism and Black equality are the same things. So that's a mini version of the 90-minute lecture. I want to mention two final books in parting. Brother Man, The Odyssey of Black Men in America. 150 selections from Black men on how Black men see themselves. What a radical idea. A book on how we see ourselves. This filled a big void in the literature. It's an anthology. It was written with Herb Boyd. It's won some awards. If you haven't had a chance to look at it. And then, of course, probably the greatest book of all, The Obama Phenomenon, which Robert did with Robert Chrisman and me. And I think it's notable for its broad range of perspectives, of Black perspectives on Obama's election. I remember Robert saying to me in an introduction one time when he was introducing himself, he said, "I'm a poor little colored boy from Georgia." I think that poor little colored boy from Georgia really did good.
Michael Omi, Professor Emeritus in Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley.
Thanks, Daphne. Hey, Charles, you did such a succinct and excellent job of covering the scholarship. It didn't leave me a whole bunch to stay here, but let me say this. Beginning in 1980, Robert Allen was my boss at Mills College in Oakland. He was chair of the Ethnic Studies Department, and I was a lecturer who was taking forever to finish his dissertation. But it's really a pleasure to be here today. I mean, I remember Casey as a little boy, and haven't seen you in all these years since that, but I remember going, it was a science project that you and your dad were doing for some science fair. And I remember he was trying to explain all this stuff to me. It's also where I got to meet Daphne Muse, and we actually taught a class together. I initially read Black Awakening in Capitalist America as an undergraduate here at Berkeley. And to illustrate how long ago that was, the cover price on my copy, which I purchased new, was $2.50. But my understanding of racial domination in the US and globally was really profoundly influenced by this classic text. And Rickey Vincent's right. If you haven't read it, you got to read it. It's extremely important. While scholars in the late 60s and 70s were utilizing the internal colonial model to describe the patterns of external domination of the Black community, Robert Allen was calling our attention to how, in his words, quote, colonial rule is predicated upon an alliance between the occupying power and indigenous forces of conservatism and tradition, end of quote. As a result of the Black urban rebellions that swept the major cities in the 1960s, Allen argued that the white power structure experienced a deepening crisis of hegemony and control, and that new strategies of containment were being proposed and advanced that were rooted in the ongoing dynamics of repression and reform. While we're all familiar with the tactics of repression exemplified by the FBI's war on the Black Panther Party, Allen focused our attention on white elite reform as a strategy of control and containment. Allen understood the shifting patterns of racial domination through, as Charles reminds us, through the lens of neocolonialism. He argued that neocolonialism was his conscious political project to subvert and destabilize the revolutionary potential of growing Black militancy. It was a project that was conceived and orchestrated by America's white corporate elite, led by organizations such as the Ford Foundation, the Urban Coalition, and the National Alliance of Businessmen. The corporate elite was attempting to co-opt the Black Power movement by equating Black power with Black capitalism. Allen argued that this white elite found a willing ally in what he saw as this new militant, he said, Black middle class, which in fact emerged, became a significant social force following World War II. This new Black middle class, he argued, would serve as a buffer between the white power structure and the Black domestic colony by managing local state institutions, such that of education, welfare, and policing, among others. Perhaps more importantly, Allen warned that the rhetoric of Black nationalism was being deployed to establish neocolonial control of the Black community, and that some Black militant groups were in fact guilty of facilitating this process. The upshot of his overall argument was that the long-established colonial relationship between whites and Blacks in the US was assuming a new neo-colonial form, one that had profound implications for both political organization and action. I want to say just a couple of bullet points. I timed this too, so you wouldn't have to pull me off.
Keep going,
Daphne?
keep going.
A couple of other points I want to mention. Allen's scholarship consistently focused on issues of agency and resistance. As Charles Henry talked about in Reluctant Reformers, published in 1974 with Pam Allen, was a study of this impact on racism on social reform movements, such as the Populist Party and, as Charles mentioned, too, women's suffrage. And Black Awakening also looked at groups like SNCC, like the Black Panther Party, to assess their strengths and their weaknesses as agents of social change in the face of these shifting patterns of racial domination. Secondly, I want to say that we should all appreciate this important work in a long continuum of writing about both the Black community as a domestic colony, as a nation within a nation. And in fact, Allen did in fact draw upon the work of numerous scholars, including Du Bois, Cruz, Fanon, Malcolm X, and Touré, to make this point about how colonialism can morph into a kind of neoconservative or neocolonial control of the Black community. But also, we should think that going forward, his work came to later resonate among Latin American scholars like Quijano and Mignolo, who were talking about the coloniality of power and also about the prospects of decolonization. For me, Allen provided a penetrating analysis of racial domination that highlighted the shifting patterns of white elite reform and really deepening class contradictions within the Black community. Robert Allen, we used to refer to him as Big Bob, didn't we?
We did.
Left an indelible impression on me. And I'm really going to miss his astute political insights, his real calm demeanor in the face of really troubling times. And especially, I'm gonna miss his terrific sweet potato pie.
Oh, yes. Lindsey? And we're a little pressed for time, but I hope we can keep rolling.
All right, good afternoon. I wasn't planning on speaking. I'm just actually going to read some comments from Leah Bascomb, or Dr. Leah Bascomb, who's an alum from this department and who was expecting to speak today but is not feeling well. So I'm sharing the words that she wrote. Robert Lee Allen was lovely to me. He was certainly the calmest revolutionary I ever met. My first association with the Black scholar was publishing in it, an experience wholly started by Dr. Allen. After a traumatic but ultimately successful QE experience, it was Robert that helped me find my confidence again. Jay Finley and I were his GSIs for 5B, and he asked us to do a guest lecture based on our own work. Then he asked me to review one of his articles. Then he asked me to be invited to participate in the symposium for the 40th anniversary of his Black awakening in capitalist America. Just like that. Like I had something to say and was worthy of his time. And at that conference, he made me feel intellectually at home and safe. He read his declassified FBI file as his keynote address, noting it as an example of horrible research. He deftly deflected canonization, accepting his admirers' respect, while drawing boundaries and carefully not taking credit for what wasn't his, while wanting to hear more about what could have been. I learned about his life in Atlanta, how his first degree was in mathematics and physics, and he still kept up with that field. I hadn't known about his work as a social worker or how Blake's bar became his favorite. He was reporting on the student strikes and got cracked in the head by a police, but was able to duck into Blake's. It's gone now. Telegraph Avenue has changed. But that was about the same moment that the Black scholar was born, out of the protest that made our field possible in these spaces, and providing an outlet for professional and organic intellectuals to do the work of Black studies. The symposium resulted in a special issue of the Black Scholar, which I think was my first academic publication. He made sure I knew I was intellectually worthy and provided space to let others know too. It wasn't only intellectual and emotional support that he provided, but also material support. Robert Allen got me the position of doing books received for the Black Scholar. He taught me how to use promotional materials to do quick write-ups and manage my time according to the pay. He allowed me to take a book or two for free as long as I asked first, and he told me to let him know if I didn't want to do a full review of any of them, and I did. He let me keep a copy of Paul Marshall's Triangular Road, and I reviewed it for the Black Scholar. The work later led to another article published as a special issue dedicated to Marshall's work. He wasn't my advisor, but through our work on the Black Scholar, in his own way, he taught me the field of doing the books received page, gave me access to literal boxes of new scholarship, and I learned how valuable opportunities like these are, whether in service to journals or serving on prize committees. And the work kept coming. And in parentheses, she writes, I stayed broke. When he and Charles Henry did an edited collection on Obama, I learned how to write an index. When I was late with it, he told me to calm down. These things happen. And again, when he wrote his last book on C.L. Dellums and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, I got the indexing gig and he paid me way more than we agreed. When I asked about it, he said, take it, and that I had earned it. Although I worked in different areas than him, the work that Robert Allen did has been central to my growth as an intellectual. The growth that happened in the 40 years that Robert Allen was associated with the Black scholar was phenomenal. I've taught its articles, used them in my research, and find myself eagerly awaiting the new scholarship it produces. The lessons behind the foundations of the journal are a consistent reminder of the function of Black studies, which Robert wrote in quotes, must be to create enemies of racism, enemies of oppression, enemies of exploitation, end quote. His mentorship, his kindness, his intellectual veracity all served as a clear example of what this means. He was the kind of mentor that moved with ease. He didn't just teach us, he quietly showed us how. He was kind and real, and he showed up for us, celebrating the disfellowship with drinks, Robert, Lee, and Lindsey, for us mentees, for his colleagues, for all of us who have wanted to change the world. He's gone home. I know we all do, but I wasn't ready. I've learned how to mourn him now. I think the best way is to live his legacy. With love and respect, Dr. Leah Bascomb.
Fantastic. So, closing us out is Reverend Diana McDaniel, President of the Board of Directors of the Friends of Port Chicago National Memorial. Reverend McDaniel.
Yeah. Is it all right if I hold it?
Yeah, sure.
I'm used to holding a mic. And I'm not an academic, but I have enjoyed being here listening. It's been wonderful. So good afternoon. I've known Robert for about 20 years, more than 20 years now. And we talked on the phone a lot. We would strategize and we would meet monthly. We have our National Park contingent here, our National Park Service. I'm going to start with Robert's words. He said it was in the late 1970s that he first learned about Port Chicago. He, by accident, came across a copy of an old yellowing pamphlet which was entitled Mutiny, ? The story of how the Navy branded 50 fear-shocked sailors as mutineers. He said the first line in the pamphlet was, "Remember Port Chicago?" He said he didn't remember. He didn't know anything about it. He had never heard of Port Chicago. The pamphlet was published by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in 1945. He read it, he was curious, and he was hooked. The men were fearlocked because of a tragic explosion at the Navy's largest ammunition handling facility on the West Coast during World War II. Some 1,400 ammunition loaders worked around the clock in our racially segregated military. Their labor was essential to our victory. Robert spent more than half his life working on honoring the men who served at Port Chicago and pointing out the social and historical significance of the work of the African-American sailors who were doing the backbreaking and dangerous job of loading munitions on ships that were going off to the armed forces in the Pacific. He worked to have the so-called mutineers exonerated. I don't know how many of you know the story, but after the explosion, the African-American sailors were ordered to go back to work. The white sailors went off for 30 days leave. And so they decided they weren't going to go back to work, 258 of them, I believe it was. And they decided they weren't going to go. They had not been trained to load munitions. They had not been given proper equipment. They weren't even given gloves. So they decided they would stop and not, and Robert always called it a work stoppage. So Robert, when he discovered who the men were and that this had happened, he decided to buy a ticket, a bus ticket, and then he traveled around the country to find these guys to interview them and talk to them. And it was one of those things where these men really hadn't even told their families about their stories. Not, I don't think any of them did. And there was Cyril Shepherd's family. They are just discovering it. They didn't know. There was, he went to one young man's home, and the young man's been, if you've seen anything about the exoneration on the news, you may have seen some of the people who shared their stories. And one of them said that when he came home one day, Robert was there in the living room talking to his father, and he'd never seen his father cry. And his father was crying, and he didn't know why. But he learned the story that day because of Robert. We worked to have those so-called mutineers exonerated. And we didn't know what an exoneration would look like. We didn't know if it would be a presidential proclamation. Would they overturn their convictions? We had no idea. We really didn't know. We just knew that it was going to happen at some point. We didn't think it would happen in our lifetimes, but it did. We worked with George Miller, the congressman, John Lawrence, who was George Miller's former chief of staff, who worked with Nancy Pelosi. I mean, we worked it, you know, with as much as we could do with writing letters, making phone calls, doing all the things. And one of the beauties was Robert was right there all the time. You know, it was, okay, so what's next? Who's gonna do that? You know, when we, whatever the idea was for us to find a way to have them exonerated. And I'm not really sure when I met Robert, but the first thing we started talking about was an exoneration plan. And so who was going to write this exoneration plan? You know, when we said, all decided, there were 5 of us really that came together. Robert named us the Port Chicago Committee. And it sounded a little radical, you know? And so our job was to keep the story alive. And so to keep the story alive and have people know about it and then get them to support us, what better way than to work with the National Park Service? They keep the story alive and we'll keep it together forever, right? So I really didn't know what we were doing at the time, but it really has worked very well. Thank you. So we asked Robert to write the exoneration plan because he was the author. He was the writer. He was the brilliant man. We had things that needed to be done, like resolutions that needed to be given to Congress. So Robert would write the resolution. If there was something that needed to come together, we'd all sit there and huddle and talk about it, strategize, and find a way to get it done. We were small, but we were mighty. We were partnering with the National Park Service and collaborating with the National Park Conservation Association. I don't know if you know who they are, but they really are. We had lobbyists. We're a nonprofit that had lobbyists. I don't know how that happened. We had a wonderful relationship, strategizing on how we could keep the story alive. I am president of the Friends of Port Chicago National Memorial. We changed the name when we decided to legally organize. And Robert, David Salniker, and I are the legal founders, the ones that signed our names on the paper. And we worked together, strategized, and met every month. And someone would always say, what do we do next? Someone called me to ask me if I would testify in front of Congress about Port Chicago, the Port Chicago story. I said, let me swallow hard and say, you want me to testify? I called Robert. I said, Robert, will you do it? He said, sure, I'll do it. So I mean, we did so many things together. I mean, we went to the Anti-Defamation League put on a Against Hate concert. We're there. They're honoring people from Port Chicago. Robert was there. He was the star. He was the one. And I just have to say that with all the things that we've done, we achieved the National Park Service. The 392nd National Park is the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial. We have the Thurgood Marshall Regional Park, the home of the Port Chicago 50. We have so many things. We've achieved exoneration, which was an amazing feat. But it wasn't just Robert, but without Robert, we wouldn't have known about this story. Without Robert, he was like the impetus that kept, he was just the, what is it they call it on a boat, the little thing that keeps you going, the rudder, and it was Robert Allen. And he would just sit there very quietly and listen to what we talk about. He said, yeah, I think we can do that. He was a wonderful man. Let me read something and I'll be done. This came just this morning because somebody asked me to reach out to the Secretary of the Navy. Oh. And so they said, this comes from Carlos Del Toro, the Secretary of the Navy. He said, I would like to express my deepest condolences to Dr. Allen's family, friends, colleagues, and students. His work raised essential awareness about the courageous legacy of the Port Chicago 50 and the hundreds of sailors who faced courts-martial with them. It certainly informed my decision to exonerate them on behalf of the Navy. May his work continue to inspire future generations that it is never too late to address historic wrongs and fight for what is right.
Thank you, Reverend. Thank you so much. So in closing out, the Secretary of the Navy was born in Cuba. The irony of that is not lost on me, and I'm sure it was one of, yes, on us. So I would now like to read a statement regarding Robert's life and a testimony to who he was and his character. The United States Congress, in memoriam, honoring the life of Robert Lee Allen Jr., sunrise, May 29, 1942, sunset, July 10, 2024, in whose loving memory we pay tribute and reverence, rest in peace and power, on behalf of the 12th Congressional District of California, I express my deepest condolences. Barbara Lee, Member of Congress. And by the way, Robert's papers are at the Bancroft.
Yes.
Students, use his papers, please.
Yes.
They're going to get there, Pat.
Yes. Thank you, Miss Muse, for keeping us going. Show some love for Miss Muse. Yes. And we have been able to assemble here because of the staff of the Department of African American Studies. Lindsey and Maria and Barbara and Sandy, so thankful for all of your work and your energy. Now we want to invite all of you downstairs to a lunch and on the 6th floor to honor our colleague, Professor Robert Allen. And I am hoping that those of you who are in here, students, can just like hold on to all of what you heard, because the power of one person being able to do all of these things and to touch all of our lives is just amazing. And so in many ways, so thankful for Professor Robert Allen. And now I assume all of you know why we insisted on making this celebration of his life happen once we found out that he had passed. So on behalf of the Department of African American Studies, the Department of Ethnic Studies, please go downstairs and join us for a meal. And for all of you who are online, thank you for joining us.